A scathing allegation from the U.S. president about the war in Gaza. In an interview with Time magazine published today, Joe Biden said Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu may be stalling on ending the war for political reasons. But when pressed by a reporter at an event this afternoon, Biden appeared to backtrack.
Is Prime Minister Netanyahu playing politics with the war?
I don't think so. He's trying to work out a serious problem he has.
What is clear is the challenge Netanyahu is facing. He is scrambling to stop his emergency cabinet and potentially his coalition government from collapsing. Far-right Israeli ministers are threatening to quit and bring down the government should Netanyahu agree to a ceasefire proposal unveiled by Biden. The White House says it expects Israel to agree to the plan. Hamas has yet to officially respond. Jonathan Conricus is a retired lieutenant colonel, serving most recently as an international spokesperson in the Israel Defense Forces. He's now a senior fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Hello.
Hello.
When this ceasefire deal was presented by Joe Biden, he said that it came from Israel, and yet the Israeli government does not seem to be embracing the plan. Why are we seeing this resistance?
I think that is related to the internal political dealings in Israel. The tensions between the Prime Minister and certain parts of his government who are apparently not supportive of this current deal. And regardless of them, I think that the basic issue that has been making a deal so far impossible is the Hamas demand that in return for a slow trickle of a release of hostages, Israel ends the war. That has been Hamas's strategic objective for a long, long time, basically since the end of the first ceasefire. And that is something that I think Israel has said pretty clearly that it will not agree to, and I don't think that Israel will agree to it.
I do want to talk more about Hamas, but I would just like to understand the tension that you refer to off the top. It has been said that Netanyahu has to choose between his government and ending the war. Do you think the consequences are that stark, that for him politically it is almost impossible to accept the ceasefire deal?
I'm no political expert at all, but I don't think so. I think that the political prospects of his coalition partners aren't great. The polling of the last 5-6 months suggests tremendous dissatisfaction amongst Israeli voters with them, their policies, and how they are managing the war. And I'm not very sure that they would have a better fate if they cause the government to collapse, they're blamed for it, and then have to face the consequences at the ballot. Many things can happen, but again, without being a political expert, I think they make strong statements. Not entirely sure that they will follow them up, especially not if there is strong Israeli popular support for the hostages. We are talking about 126 hostages still in captivity. 42 are confirmed dead, and we don't know how many others are alive. There's sketchy information about it, including women, children, a baby who was captured when he was 9 months old and today is more than a year and a half old.
When it comes to the question of Hamas, Netanyahu has said that Israel will not agree to a ceasefire unless Hamas's military and governing capabilities are totally destroyed. Biden has said Hamas is no longer capable of carrying out large-scale attacks on Israel, and the U.S. State Department said that the U.S. position is that Hamas cannot be eliminated by military means alone. Are the Americans wrong?
In short, I would say that they are not assessing the situation correctly. And I can understand why, because it is not their civilians who are at stake.
What is it that you...
It is Israeli civilians who are exposed to Hamas. And it's not only about what's going on now and whether Hamas has the ability to now launch a significant attack against Israel. If you measure it in an immediate time frame, I think that the American statement is correct. But that isn't the time frame that Israel is looking. Southern communities have been devastated, burned to the ground, houses ruined, and civilians have either been killed, wounded, or evacuated. For Israelis to be able to return to their homes and to rebuild their lives, the area needs to be safe. And safe means that Hamas doesn't only now not have the capabilities, but doesn't have any capacity to rebuild significantly and to launch attacks in the imminent future. That, I think, is the main difference. And I understand that the Americans want to end the war. I personally think that the single most important commitment that the Israeli military and government have is to protect their civilians. To satisfy allies is important. To appease the international community is nice, but any government should first and foremost take care of defending its sovereignty and its civilians.
And yet the goals have to be realistic. And so I wonder, I mean, is it possible to entirely eliminate Hamas? You have the United States saying it can't be done by military alone.
I definitely think that it can be done. And it took a coalition of 38 countries, I believe it was, about 2 years to eliminate ISIS. That was led by the US, trillions and trillions of dollars, a bombing campaign, and then boots on the ground in various cities. Eventually, ISIS was defeated militarily. It took, I think, longer time than what most people would have wanted. But at the end of the day, they were defeated.
And yet we still see, I mean, there is still ISIS presence in the world. The defeat of the Taliban, there was a massive military campaign to end its rule.
Taliban wasn't defeated.
Well, indeed, it wasn't defeated. And so my question to you is, as tens of thousands of people have been killed during this campaign, are you describing a prospect where we continue to see these levels of death while Israel tries to achieve an objective that just may not be possible, to entirely root out or stamp out an idea?
No, we're not talking about stamping out an idea, and that's very important to stress that difference. It's one thing to stamp out an idea and to defeat an idea. The idea of extremist Islam has not been defeated. I'm sure that if we walk the streets of Ottawa, we'll find people who espouse their ideology, who want to build a Sharia-based state and eliminate Western democracies and anything that isn't Sharia-based. That doesn't mean that ISIS wasn't defeated militarily. And that's exactly the distinction that I'm making. Hamas, as a military and governing organization, can, and I believe, will be defeated by Israel. The idea of jihad, of holy religious war against Israel, I'm not sure that it will be defeated in the immediate time.
But is it clear to you that that will cost, if it is indeed a list of individuals that must be, as you put it, eliminated, that tens of thousands of more lives could be on the line, many of them innocent civilians?
I don't think that it's tens of thousands. And really, again, I go back to what I said before. The responsibility of the Israeli government and its military is to protect its civilians. We saw on October the 7th.
It has responsibilities in terms of international warfare, in terms of the people whose lives are affected too.
Yes, but they are secondary to defending their own civilians. Any government, first and foremost, has to defend its sovereignty and its civilians. And to think that upholding or respecting international law is more important than defending your civilians is totally wrong. And I don't think that any government would agree with, let's choose law over defending our civilians.
It sounds like you're saying that it's acceptable to violate international law in order
to...
Not
at all. I'm saying that these are priorities.
If not uphold, then the alternative is to violate.
The objective of a government is to defend its civilians. That's the most sacred and basic duty. Sadly, the Israeli government and the military didn't succeed in that on October the 7th. And what Israel is doing now is making sure that for the foreseeable future, that entity, Hamas, won't be able to have the actual capacity, the actual military tools in order to do anything substantial against Israel again, and that they won't have the administrative control over Gaza. I think that's very plain. It's understandable. I think it's totally doable. I understand that there are political powers who do not want to see it happen. But at the end of the day, Israel needs to do what is right for Israeli civilians.
When we speak of international law, as you know well, the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants for leaders in Hamas, as well as Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The prosecutor alleges in part that Israeli leaders are perpetuating war crimes, including using starvation as a means of warfare, willfully causing great suffering, and intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population. Israel has refuted these allegations. The question, though, when we look at the numbers, and I know that you do not agree necessarily, or the Israeli officials certainly have not agreed with the numbers out of the Hamas-run health agency, but Benjamin Netanyahu himself has said that he believes that 30,000 people have been killed in this war. Was there no other way for Israel to achieve its goals without the kind of massive suffering we've seen?
First of all, the massive suffering is the responsibility of Hamas.
Every single one of those deaths.
That has to be said very clearly. This is a war that wasn't started or initiated by Israel. The tactics chosen were not Israeli tactics, and the fact that Hamas hides behind their civilians is something that Israel would gladly want to fight differently.
But Israel is responsible for the tactics of its own military.
It is, but we cannot detach it from how the enemy is fighting. And I don't think that you could give me any single example of another military that telegraphed its intentions ahead of time and evacuated civilians from the battlefield, and by doing so, indicating to its enemy where it was going next. That's unheard of in military history. It's a tremendous disadvantage when you do that, but Israel did it and is still doing it because it wants to minimize collateral damage, and it wants to take away that tool from Hamas, which it is using very cynically, and that is putting civilians at risk.
And yet UNICEF says Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child right now.
I am not impressed by anything, any single statement said by any UN entity, after having seen up close how many UN entities have been collaborating, supporting Hamas, facilitating the activities of Hamas. Allow me not to be impressed by any statement coming out of UN bodies in Gaza. I think that there should be a day of reckoning for the UN, and I worked at the UN and I've worked at UN headquarters. There should be a day of reckoning for the UN headquarters, its leadership, and their programs in Gaza for being part of a unholy alliance where their work sustained the regime of a terrorist organization.
The UN writ large, you would hold to that level of responsibility
UNICEF,
rather than
the World Health Program, and first and foremost UNRWA. Had UNRWA not been in place and had they not provided cover, daily activities, sanitation, schooling, etc. for Gaza, Hamas wouldn't have been able to divert all of the assets that they diverted to terror against Israel. And it has been exposed, I know it's been refuted,
yes,
but that there have been hundreds of UNRWA paid staff who are also Hamas and Islamic Jihad members.
UNRWA has made its case on Power and Politics about the changes the organization is making and the work that it is doing, but we only have a few moments left, and I want to talk to you about the future of this situation. If the ceasefire deal is not accepted, what hope is there for this conflict ending anytime soon? Is it now or never in some ways, or certainly months of this ongoing suffering and deaths?
It is, I think, a very dire time for Israeli hostages, and I understand that you are very concerned with Palestinians. I am concerned with my countrymen, women and children who were dragged out of their beds in their pajamas on the 7th of October and abducted into Gaza. That is what concerns me primarily. Then I may have sympathies for civilians suffering on the other side, which they are. There is suffering, and it is unfortunate. And the time, the money time, so to say, the time of decision, it is coming ever closer. Every day there's more information about Israeli hostages that are confirmed dead instead of being alive and in captivity. And we understand that every day that goes by, the likelihood of them returning home diminishes. And yes, there is suffering on the other side. That is, by the way, one of the reasons why I think it should be in a global interest for the war to end as soon as possible, but not by ending the war and keeping Hamas in power, but by ending the war by defeating Hamas, by doing what's right, by doing what every country has an obligation to do, and that is to defend its civilians from threat and to make sure that that threat doesn't re-establish itself. If Israel doesn't finish the job in Rafah, if Israel doesn't take apart the tunnels that have been open and leading weapons into Gaza, then we are just kicking the can down the road, and we'll find ourselves in a similar situation in a year or two. And these are not my words. These are the words of Hamas leaders who have said so clearly. We will do October the 7th again and again.
Jonathan Conricus, thank you for this conversation.
Thank you.